thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really going to touch on three areas today. We got 30 minutes, so we're going to touch the two hot zones, Middle East, the current war between Israel, Iran, Hamas, and so on. Then we're going to fly over the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then we're going to land in the United States. There's an election coming up. And as Canadians, we're paying very close attention because either candidate winning, becoming the president would have an impact on us. So in terms of the Middle East, how would you summarize the current geopolitical situation, the landscape, and specifically the U.S.? Which other players, along with the U.S., are currently influential in this conflict that is one that we haven't seen in a very long time?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dimitri. Obviously, top of mind, front page of the newspaper. I guess that doesn't make sense to the younger people in the audience, but there used to be newspapers that we read that had front pages. Wow, Iran obviously is, but not just Iran. There's something going on globally that I first noticed when I was Deputy Secretary of State. And I coined an expression, and I'm proud to take credit for it. And I've now seen it mentioned in the press, including recently, for the phrase the crinks. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I remember sitting in a meeting, it was 2017-18, and these same countries were coming up with respect to problems all around the world. And I was looking for an acronym, and I said the crinks. So it's not just Iran, it's Russia. It's Russia supporting Iran in ways that Russia wasn't before. When I was ambassador, we, the United States, were engaged with the Russian Federation in part to try to resurrect the JCPOA, but also trying to help the IAEA with its inspections in Iran. And now that script has been completely torn up, and the Russians and Iran are collaborating and cooperating. There's talk, for example, of a notorious criminal who was traded by the United States on August 1st, Victor Bout, now participating in supplying weapons to the Houthis in Yemen, another Iran proxy. So we think about these conflicts as geographic conflicts that are discrete, but they're not. They're interrelated. And with respect to the conflict originally in Gaza and Israel, now expanded, there's always been violence on the northern border of Israel with Hezbollah, but expanded into a second front in this new war. The actions that the Israelis, I think, really by fortuity, that occurred in recent days with the killing of the most recent leader of Hamas, Sinwar, may present an opportunity. I know that the Biden administration is pressing the narrative, okay, you killed the guy who organized October 7th. Now let's really seriously focus on peace. I don't think that will succeed, and it won't succeed not just with Prime Minister Netanyahu or his government, but I think with a lot of Israelis. Until they're convinced that Hamas is not going to threaten them from Gaza, this will continue. And you and I were talking about this before our session here. You'll recall that President Biden drew a line on an Israeli incursion into Rafah some months ago. And it was another example of the Israelis doing something that the Biden administration had warned them against. And where did they kill Sinwar?
That's right.
In Rafah. So,
one last question on this. Does Israel stop after its succeeded regime change in Iran? Is that the ultimate objective? Because whether you're talking about Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, terrorist organizations that are pegged in areas like Iraq, ultimately they're perceived in many ways, truthfully, to be proxies for Iran's ultimate objective to wipe Israel off the face of the map.
Yeah.
So does Israel stop now that they've eliminated Sinwar, or is regime change in Iran the ultimate objective?
Regime behavior change is the objective. Iran has been emboldened for years in supporting, and its aggression has become most apparent in the last year or two, and through its proxies, the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah. So I think regime behavior change in Tehran is what the Israelis seek, and ultimately, I think that would. I don't think that the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, will never feel confident in Israel's security so long as that the government, the regime that exists that governs Iran today, remains in power. That's just a fact.
You mentioned Russia in your opening answer, so maybe we do talk about the Russia-Ukraine ongoing war, a war that was supposed to last less than 2 weeks. So from your experience, have Russia's objectives changed from when they initially started the war and they thought they would steamroll into Ukraine and take over Ukraine in 2 weeks versus today's objectives after this war has been going on for almost 2 years now?
Yeah, well, approaching 3 years
Right.
in February of next year, which will be here before you know it. Whether Ukraine will continue to exist in February of 25 is something that I hope we in the West continue to ensure that we support Ukraine and oppose Russian aggression. So in answer to your question, no, absolutely not. The Russians, Putin has, as he has explained his war aims, they are to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. You can add to that a third, which is the Russian Federation has absorbed 4 new regions, oblasts, into Russia, incorporating Ukrainian sovereign territory, claiming it is now the territory of the Russian Federation. And for those of you who recall, there were constitutional amendments in Russia proposed in January of 2020, just as I was after I'd arrived as ambassador, and everyone focused on the amendment to the Russian Constitution's term limit, which was modified to allow Putin to run for 2 more 6-year terms starting in 2024, which he did this year, was reelected in March. A little noticed constitutional amendment, which we at the U.S. Embassy flagged for Washington, was the Russian Constitution now provides that it is unconstitutional. No Russian leader may separate any Russian territory and give it to another country. So it's unconstitutional for Putin to give back any of the territory that the Russian Federation has seized from Ukraine, starting with Crimea. I would annoy my Russian interlocutors and friends when I would say, well, thank goodness that provision didn't bind the Tsar when Secretary Seward purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire, and didn't think that was very funny. So no, his war aims have not changed, will not change. They are non-negotiable. The Russians are I really enjoyed serving in Russia. It's a challenge to engage with them, and they are saying now the following: we're open to negotiation. Of course we are. We're open to negotiation, except you have to accept some facts on the ground. And then they list, all the territory that we've seized is ours. The neo-Nazism in Ukraine is eliminated, which means the Zelensky government, democratically elected Jewish president, the drill. Grandfather fought with the Red Army. That Nazi has to be removed from power, and Ukraine can no longer be a military threat to the Russian Federation. So that means Ukraine surrenders. We're willing to negotiate Ukraine's surrender. There is no negotiation with Putin, and more specifically with Russia. It's not just Putin. Yes, Putin is the leader And as Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma, has said, Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin. But if Putin, doesn't wake up tomorrow, has a stroke, doesn't wake up tomorrow, the war doesn't end. So yeah, the Russian war aims have not changed their tactics. They've been forced to change tactics because of how badly they've stumbled, as you note, starting from the very first days of the war.
Which prompts me to ask you, we served at the same time. You were with President George W. Bush when I was with Prime Minister Harper. There was a famous NATO summit in Romania, where NATO rolled out the red carpet to Vladimir Putin in an effort to, famous word, appeasement.
Yeah.
Simultaneously at that summit, I remember Prime Minister Harper pushing at the time for Ukraine to create a path for Ukraine to get NATO membership.
Yeah.
And more than 15 years later, so I can speak more openly now, at the time, President Obama and Chancellor Merkel were opposed to Ukraine joining NATO in order to appease Russia. So,
we in the United States would not have used those terms back then, appeasing Russia. It probably would have inferred it and said we want to provoke Russia, and it gets back to among the original sins that the Russians accused the United States of, and we've got a lot of them because they say we're actually satanic. So we're the father and mother of all sins. Among the sins that we've committed were aggressive, relentless NATO eastward expansion, which is a complete fiction. First, the Russians say, Putin says that there was a promise that NATO would expand not 1 inch further to the east. And the promise made by, as alleged by Secretary James Baker to Mikhail Gorbachev. Both Baker and Gorbachev have said never happened. Discussions about NATO were in the context of the continued existence, by the way. The Soviet Union was in existence. The Warsaw Pact was in existence when this discussion occurred. And the discussion was about reunifying Germany and whether NATO troops would go into East Germany in the process of reunifying Germany. And there was a promise about a delay, West Germany and NATO, East Germany not, reunifying them, Germany and NATO, and where NATO troops would be stationed. But I digress. Here's my point. To the Russians who say it was relentless NATO eastward expansion, it's the same trope they use with Ukraine. They deny the ability, the authority, the right of Ukrainians to decide what they want to do for the security of their country. What the Russians can't admit is that what happened, and this wasn't a sure bet that the United States was going to support in the late 90s, the admission of the former Warsaw Pact, some of the former Warsaw Pact countries, and even more significantly, some of the former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, into NATO. That wasn't an easy question. Kennan was opposed, famous American diplomat and observer of all things Russian. What was actually going on was the aspirations of 100 million people in Eastern Europe who'd been under the thumb of the Soviet Union for decades. Ask the Czechs about the Prague Spring, about Operation Danube in August 1968. We'll go back to 56. It was westward looking by those Eastern Europeans who'd been dominated from what the Russians would call the center in Moscow. It was their aspirations for freedom protection from NATO. And if the Russians object to that, they object to sovereignty for all those millions and millions of people in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, in Poland, Czechia, you name it. So it's how the Russians have turned history, the political historical narrative, on its head to justify an aggressive war against Ukraine.
Quick question and quick answer. Do you think today, based on what's happened over the last almost 3 years, is there a path for Ukraine to gain NATO membership?
Yes. There is. It's been validated by NATO, by President Biden, his predecessors. What the timeline for that path is, that's the problem. As you know, it's been a long time since that first commitment was made for admission of Ukraine to NATO. It would really, my view is, for this war, for this problem, and the problem is Russian aggression. The problem isn't Ukraine. You know, I say to my friends, my fellow Republicans in Washington, who insist on saying things like, I'm more concerned about the southwestern border of the United States than I am about Ukraine's borders. I'm more concerned about the United States economy than I am about the Ukrainian economy or U.S. security. Like, you're focused on the wrong thing. Well, I'll credit, okay, you don't care about Ukraine. I disagree, but let's put that to one side. Let's accept that premise. What's your policy for dealing then with Russia? You can't say the same. If you say you don't care about Russia, you don't care about a large, as the SACEUR commander in Europe, General Cavoli, recently said, a large, angry, heavily armed Russia looming over Eastern Europe with the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. If you don't have a policy that addresses Russian aggression and the Russian Federation as it exists today, then, you know, I don't know what you're thinking. Why are you voting for a U.S. defense budget, which, if you expand the scope to include not just the Defense Department, the military, but the intelligence community, classified, unclassified, it's almost $1 trillion. If you think we can ignore Russia and its aggression, why are we spending you're worried about 61 billion going to Ukraine? Why are we spending $1 trillion to defend ourselves? And the answer can't be, well, we just defend ourselves against China, against the PRC, because that's the generational challenge. That's the pacing challenge. I don't recall President Roosevelt saying that in December of 41, after the Third Reich declared war on the United States days after Pearl Harbor. I mean, the United States can't make the choice about the American president can't decide, I'll worry about this threat, this country that considers itself an enemy of the United States, and not about this one. So, sorry, I've kissed the Blarney Stone twice. I'm an Irishman. You asked for a short answer, but my apologies.
Last question on Ukraine. What would you say are the key factors that have contributed to Ukraine's resilience to, again, this war that was supposed to last less than a couple of weeks?
Yeah, completely misdiagnosed by the United States. We were pretty confident, bordering on certainty, which the intelligence community never is, that Russia was going to invade, but completely missed how Ukraine was going to be able to successfully resist. Two mistakes. First, overestimating Russia's capacity and underestimating not just the leadership of the Ukrainian government and Zelensky in and of himself personally. Talk about a man in the moment meeting. Everybody thought, including the U.S. ambassador to Russia, that Zelensky would have been lucky to survive. He would have been lucky to be like Dubček in 68, right? In 68, Dubček gets put on a plane, flown to Moscow, re-educated, sent back to Czechoslovakia. They send him back home to Slovakia, and he's a forest ranger for the next few decades. Zelensky would have been lucky to survive. But the Ukrainians, and it was not just the government and the heroes on the front lines who resisted, was the Ukrainian people. And if you'll indulge me for one moment, I've written a book about my experiences in Moscow, and this video I saw had such an impact on me. I write about it in the book. It's a couple of days after the so-called special military operation began. And as you know, Russia is enveloping Ukraine, moving south from Belarus, west from Russia, north from Crimea. And there are Russian paratroopers walking down the main street of a village in southern Ukraine who have moved. The Russians have moved out of out of Crimea, and they're in full battle kit, masks on, automatic weapons, and in a combat formation, moving through this village. And a woman, an older woman, walks up to them, and somebody standing behind her has got I guess, a cell phone camera, and she says to them in Russian, and I will sanitize her remarks as translated. She walks up to the lead trooper and says, what the F are you doing in my village? You're effing fascists. Get the F out of my country. And the Russians, knowing what we now know about Russian war crimes across Ukraine, including in Bucha, the notion this woman had the nerve to do that, it's pretty extraordinary. But she goes a step further. She reaches, and she had planned to do this. She reaches into a pocket and takes out a fistful of seeds, and the sunflower is the national flower of Ukraine. And she holds them in the paratrooper's face and says, "Here, put these in your pockets, so that when you die, when you're killed here and you're buried here, something good will grow out of you in your presence." And I remember thinking, whoa, I called colleagues from the embassy, my colleagues I worked with, you got to see this. I mean, if the Ukrainians resist like this one, the Russians might be in trouble. And they were, and they still are.
So one question, four answers. What does U.S. foreign policy look like under a Trump or Harris administration for both the Middle East and the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
So the easy narratives are Trump withdraws support for Ukraine, and he's more bullish in supporting Israel and the Netanyahu government. I think that's too simple. I'm not saying that there is a significant risk for Ukraine, for U.S. foreign policy and national security, that Trump will withdraw support for Ukraine. But as I hope my last story illustrated, even if the United States withdraws support, the Ukrainians aren't going to stop fighting the Russians. I mean, this is going to go on for this thing between the Russians and the Ukrainians, a huge mistake by Putin. So Trump, the easy answer is, and because I'm trained as a lawyer, it depends. Right? But you know what? I'd say the same thing about Harris, and Harris in particular. It depends on whom she appoints. I have no idea who's going to be her Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. Similarly to Trump, if my former boss, Mike Pompeo, is, as some speculate, the next Secretary of Defense, that bodes much better for Ukraine, because I know what Pompeo thinks about Russia and Ukraine, than if it's some other person who is more aligned with the public statements that Trump has been making. What do I attribute them to? It's pure politics. If Biden's for it, if Trump's against it, right? And my view is that the national security of the United States, and that's what's at stake, we shouldn't be playing politics with it. So Trump is so unpredictable. My experience, I can't give you a good read. I'll give you. I'm sorry. I'm talking your time. Let me just give you one.
I think the room wants us to go into overtime.
Think about this. Zelensky said this, I think, yesterday. I mean, he's trying to sell his victory plan, right? And he's talking to the Europeans. He said, we in Ukraine have a large, heavily armed, trained, experienced military, more so than Germany, France, and the UK. We can, and he's addressing this and also to the United States, we can replace, once we resolve our problems with Russia and stabilize that, we can use Ukrainian troops to replace American troops in Europe, so the United States can focus on its, pick your favorite word that the administration uses, the generational challenge, the pacing challenge, et cetera, which is the PRC. That's music to Trump's ears, right? So it depends. I've seen foreign leaders appeal to Trump in ways that caused him to do things that were unanticipated. Prime Minister Abe of Japan is a great example. He was able to engage with Trump in ways that other leaders did not. So that's why I say, yeah, it's not good for Ukraine if Trump's elected, but it's too soon to say it's game over.
Middle East?
Middle East, look, I was sent by Secretary Pompeo, who would have loved to go, couldn't accompany the U.S. delegation, lead the U.S. delegation when we opened the U.S. embassy in Tel Aviv. So I went as the Deputy Secretary of State in May of 2018. There's no doubt that Trump, Biden too, to be fair, until recently has been a strong supporter, is a Zionist, is a strong supporter of Israel. Again, there's a mixed record here, though, right? Because of what the Biden administration, just focused on U.S.-Israeli relations, what Biden has said about, for example, drawing a red line on Rafah and the Israeli government and Israeli military and most Israelis disagreeing. So Biden, yeah, I think Harris continues that, although I really don't know because she hasn't had the same experience that Biden has going back to the mid-'70s in dealing with Israel. Trump, I'd be cautious about assuming that Trump is 100% behind Netanyahu. By the end of his term as president, Trump was on rocky terms with Netanyahu. So I think the public narrative on Trump undercutting Ukraine, stronger supporter of Israel, there's a basis for those two narratives, but it's not ironclad. The flip side, I think Harris, it's a much more, in some ways, unpredictable because we really don't have a good sense of who she's going to put, I don't at least, in key positions. And finally, another item of uncertainty, I don't think we're going to know who the president-elect is on November 6th. So we may not get answers to this until God knows when.
You're making this fun. I know the time says 0, but I do have one last question.
All right.
This is more, what does it mean for Canada? So I can only imagine right now, the federal government, officials in the federal government are preparing hundreds of pages of briefing books, trying to forecast what does a Harris administration mean for Canada, and probably more so what does a Trump administration mean for Canada. I mean, we had to renegotiate the free trade agreement under the Trump administration. President Trump has said he wants to do that all over again. The Biden administration, one of the first things they did when they formed government was cancel major pipeline project between Canada and the United States. So with the no time that we have left, but as you can see, the room is not moving.
Yeah.
What should we expect from either or?
So I think from a Harris administration, there was a meteorologist in my hometown, Dickie Albert, who, if the forecast for tomorrow was the same as today, would say MOTS, more of the same. I think Harris is more of the same. Trump, it's more unpredictable. He's already talked about reopening USMCA. I think energy is going to be a significant difference between a Trump administration and a Harris administration, despite the vice president's efforts to try to walk back some of the things she said previously about oil and gas, fracking, et cetera. I think that will be an area of difference. And, you know, whether there's a new government here and how that new government would react with a president-elect Harris or a president-elect Trump or a President Harris or President Trump, that'll, particularly for Trump, those personal relationships have more influence than one might think. National interests are big and difficult, mostly, in some ways, largely immutable. But for Trump, if you're trying to, and as I say, there were some leaders who got it, and late Prime Minister Abe was one. Whether it's the current government in Ottawa or a new government, how that personal interaction with Trump goes. I've seen it make a difference with Turkey. he's had a pretty rocky relationship with President Erdogan, and it went up and down depending on how their interactions were going. So,
Promise last question, but it's a quick answer. So as you know, in Canada, we don't have $1 bills. We have something called a loonie. If you had a loonie, who would you predict is going to win the next election?
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Who'd you put your loonie on?
Jeez. I was going to say I'd bury it in the ice in Vancouver the way the Bruins. Sorry. I know that hurts some of you. But trust me, the Canadians have inflicted so much emotional damage on us Bruins fans that you need to get some back. I don't know.
We'll wait for November.
I'm terrible at predicting who's going to win. I had no idea that Trump was. I assumed he was going to lose in 2016, and then look what happened to me. I got a call from Jim Matt. I wasn't involved in the campaign. I got a call out of the blue by the person that Trump had picked to be his Secretary of Defense, retired Marine four-star Jim Mattis, asking me if I'd go to work for him at the Pentagon. And that's how I came into the administration, because I was confident as a political prognosticator that the Trump couldn't win. I think if you and I get asked this question, and I ask people myself back home. I think the momentum that Harris got out of Biden dropping out, her securing the nomination, having a successful convention, the Brat Summer, the campaign of joy, that's starting to lose momentum. So it's gonna be close, and that's why I say I'm not going to be holding my breath on November 6th that we'll know who the president-elect is, and that's not a good thing.
So in short, your answer is you're not a betting man.
I'm not a betting man unless I was going to say something about the Canadians, but you've inflicted so much emotional pain on me over decades. I mean, Ken Dryden from Cornell. I mean, come on. The greatest season in 71 for the Bruins, and this kid from Cornell. Don't get me started.
Ambassador, thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.